A historic U.S. Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. Welcomed by Donald Trump, but condemned by President Joe Biden. The judgment strengthens presidential powers. Too much so, say critics. What's the long-term impact of this ruling and its timing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. There's little united in the politics of the United States at present. The polarized division is encapsulated in a Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity. A big win, said Donald Trump. A dangerous precedent, said President Joe Biden. The judgment will have profound and immediate political impact in the U.S., not least on the campaigning before November's presidential election, in which Trump is seeking to replace Biden in the White House. We'll be talking to our guest shortly about the Supreme Court decision and its legal and political implications. But first, this report from Sharif on a judgment that's shaken American politics.
After months of indictments, criminal cases and trials, Donald Trump has received some good news from the U.S. legal system. The Supreme Court handed out a landmark judgment. Former presidents are entitled to broad immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts committed while they were in office. The 6-3 ruling threw out the decision by a lower court, which had rejected Trump's claim of immunity on criminal charges involving his efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss to Joe Biden. President Biden criticized the ruling, saying it undermines the rule of law.
For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what the president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent.
3 of the court's 6 conservative justices were appointed by Trump. The 3 liberal judges, chosen by Democratic presidents, dissented, saying the ruling undermined a core democratic principle that no one is above the law. Some commentators argue the judgment goes too far, reflecting the political divisions in the court.
The defendant got all the protection he was entitled to. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy going on and not much humility in terms of the court and its willingness to take on for itself a very, very oversignificant, some would say, role in the balance of powers between the institutions of government.
Trump, who is seeking re-election in the November presidential vote, was quick to react on social media, calling it a victory for the Constitution and democracy. The federal election subversion case now goes back to the lower court. The delays could mean it won't go to trial before voters head to the polls in 4 months. On January the 6th, 2021, Trump addressed supporters and urged them to converge on the Capitol, leading to an attack.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
He was later charged on 4 counts, including conspiracy to defraud the U.S. and conspiracy against the rights of citizens. Trump has denied the charges and accused the Biden administration of carrying out a witch hunt. If he wins this election, he'll have the power to dismiss all the Justice Department prosecutions against him. Some legal analysts are alarmed.
If you have a president who is able to take all kinds of actions that a citizen or another member of the government would not be able to take, and there's no criminal accountability, to me, that's not the same separation of powers democratic system that we have now. You're veering more in at least the potential for an authoritarian or dictatorial regime.
Trump is the first former U.S. president to be criminally prosecuted and convicted. The Supreme Court ruling could affect other cases he's facing and have broad implications for the powers of the U.S. presidency. Sharif, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Pennington, New Jersey is Lynne Rambo, Professor Emerita of Constitutional Law at Texas A&M University's School of Law. She specializes in the U.S. Constitution and the Supreme Court decisions that interpret it. Steve Herman is the Voice of America's chief national correspondent and author of the book Behind the White House Curtain, a senior journalist's story of covering the president and why it matters. He's in our studio in Washington, D.C. And joining us from London, Leslie Vinjamuri is the director of the U.S. and Americas program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs think tank, also known as Chatham House. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Lynne, let me start with you today. How far-reaching are the implications of this ruling by the Supreme Court in the United States? How historic is this from a legal standpoint, and how much does it broaden the powers of the presidency in the U.S.?
Well, it's extremely expansive. It's definitely a change from what I think all of us who study the Constitution and the treatment of the president thought would be handed down. Anytime you talk about absolute immunity from criminal prosecution, you're talking about something very, very extreme. And that is what the Supreme Court recognized. It also defined official conduct so broadly and handed down a lower level of immunity that looks like a lower level of immunity, but the standard for overcoming it is so high that it will be very hard to breach.
Steve.
So it's huge.
Sure. Steve, how much will this decision embolden Trump if he is indeed elected to a second presidential term? You know, Trump already shattered norms of the office. He pushed boundaries when he previously served as president. So what does this mean going forward?
Yes, Mohammed, as you noted, Donald Trump was fairly unrestrained in his first administration, but he did have people around him, such as secretaries of state and chief of staff and White House lawyers, who could restrain him and say, look, if you do this, you're breaking the law. Now those arguments are off the table. We knew that if Trump is reelected, even before this decision, at the beginning of his second term, he was going to inundate the system, the legal system, with executive orders, hoping most of those would get through. And now it's going to be very difficult, it appears, for both the judicial branch of our government and the congressional branch, the legislative branch, to try to restrain him, and that we've always had these balances of power to prevent this from happening. And now it appears that we have really seen the strengthening of the executive branch, the president's powers.
Leslie, one of the most fundamental principles of American democracy is that no one is above the law. This ruling really strikes at that principle, doesn't it? I mean, is this saying that any future president can do whatever he or she likes so long as it falls within what is considered to be their official capacity or core constitutional power?
It certainly, as we've heard, has increased very significantly the power of the executive and specifically of the president, and in this case, seemingly reduce the ability of the courts and, through this, the people to check the power of Donald Trump for past acts. So it's very significant. We saw this in the dissenting judgments that were very powerful, saying that this was turning the president into a king. I think that the pushback is going to be very significant. But the second thing I would note is that it really takes the question of accountability and responsibility for acts that people, citizens, will see to be extreme to civil society. It sort of moves it puts pressure on civil society to hold those hearings on Congress. If you think about the January 6 hearings, there are multiple mechanisms through which not only the United States, but countries around the world have tried to hold leaders to account when the courts can't do it for all sorts of reasons, not least that the law isn't set up to hold the executive accountable. So the pressure for using those other mechanisms to push back against any abuse of authority just becomes very, very significant. And, ultimately, the power of the law is one that, any democracy needs to have. But if it's eroded, civil society will find other ways, certainly in a country like the United States, where civil society is so phenomenally robust.
Lynne, I want to talk to you for a minute more specifically about what was in the majority opinion. So I want to read a portion of what Chief Justice John Roberts wrote. He wrote, "The nature of presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority, and he is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts." The opinion also states that presidents get no immunity for unofficial acts. But how difficult is it going to be now to differentiate between what is considered an official act and an unofficial act when it comes to the office of the U.S. presidency?
I think it's going to be quite difficult. I mean, one of the things that the Supreme Court does is it hands down very, very broad guidelines and then sends it down to lower courts for them to apply. And sometimes in the guise of deciding an issue, it actually creates more questions than it answers. Their definition of official conduct is based on whether or not the president has authority that he can identify for doing a particular item. And then official conduct is divided into two parts, one that gets absolute immunity and one that gets presumptive immunity. And the ways to divide those up are not particularly clear. There's talk in the opinion about having congressional authorization or constitutional authorization, but nothing more than that. How specific does the statute giving authorization have to be, for example? All of that is unclear, and they're going to let the lower courts stab away at that in the first instance. But the thing that is so remarkable about the opinion is that there is going to be a category of action for which he will have absolute immunity to act and do so in a criminal fashion.
Steve, we just talked to Lynne about the majority opinion. I want to talk to you more specifically about the dissenting opinion, because the three liberal justices on the court issued a fierce dissent. And I just want to read a bit from what Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote. She said, "Never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. Moving forward, however, all former presidents will be cloaked in such immunity. If the occupant of that office misuses official power for personal gain, the criminal law that the rest of us must abide will not provide a backstop. With fear for our democracy, I dissent." So there is no mincing of words there. How rare is it to get a warning this stark from a sitting Supreme Court justice, even in a dissent?
Yeah, it's pretty stark and fairly unusual. And President Biden came out and made 5 minutes of remarks at the White House last evening and quoted from the dissenting opinions, saying that not only do we need to dissent, but meaning the judges and the president, the current president himself, but the American people also need to dissent. We've not heard that from President Biden before. And he also warned, as has been referenced, that we're basically converting the presidency into a sort of monarchy. And this goes back to the fundamental principles of how the United States was founded. It was a revolution, a rebellion against Britain, which had a king with sweeping powers. And so we have justices on the Supreme Court and the President of the United States and a lot of other people today saying that we're now setting up to have this country being ruled by a king in the future.
And this opinion, of course, issued just days before America's Independence Day. And Steve, let me follow up with you about what you talked about when it comes to Joe Biden's remarks. I mean, essentially, he is saying that this really raises the stakes when it comes to the upcoming election, and that the American people are the ones that are going to have the ultimate judgment when it comes to if Donald Trump will face any accountability going forward. He essentially is saying it's not going to be from the courts. That's a staggering thing to hear from a sitting American president. How much do you think this is going to impact the upcoming elections?
Well, Mohammed, you raised something very interesting that we do have the President of the United States saying this and warning about as an opponent. And this may be a silver lining for the Democrats who are fighting among themselves right now about whether Joe Biden is in a level of cognitive decline, that he should be taken off the top of the ticket and replaced by somebody else. And so now Biden, the White House, the Democratic Party leaders, the head of his campaign, could theoretically unite in saying, look, we know there are issues with Joe Biden, but the stakes are so high now with the Supreme Court decision that if you allow Donald Trump to come back into power, we're effectively going to lose our democracy. They've been trying to say that for weeks and months now, but the Supreme Court decision really gives them ample evidence to take that out on the campaign trail.
Leslie, of course, Lynne and Steve have been talking about the fact that, the critics of this decision have essentially said that this could potentially make an American president into an American monarch going forward. And I'm curious what you think about that. I mean, does this all mean that American presidents are now effectively monarch figures? Is a sitting American president become like a king, completely above the law?
Look, there's no doubt about it. This is a very significant elevation of the authority and power of the president vis-a-vis the ability of the courts to check their action. But America is a deep democracy. There are multiple parts to it. The courts are critical. The trust in those courts to be independent is critical. And we've seen the erosion of that trust in recent years, certainly during the years in which Donald Trump was president. But to reduce all of America's democracy simply to the courts and not to recognize that America's democracy at many points in our history has had moments where, protest, civil society engagement, all sorts of aspects of society have come together to force and call for social change. When it goes well, you should be able to work through those courts. But I think what we're seeing now is that pushback is going to need to be located elsewhere in the U.S. And President Biden is clearly, is taking this message and saying it's got to be at the ballot box. I think many people for a very long time have felt that the way that Donald Trump needs to be defeated, these are those people who feel like he is a threat to the norms as well as the laws that underpin America's democracy. Many people have felt that the way to defeat the former president is at the polls, that people have to vote against him. Otherwise, it won't be seen to be legitimate. There's been real concern by many that a trial that removed the former president or severely constrained his abilities would not be seen to be legitimate simply because he has such a large following in the American electorate. So, I think the basic point, though, is despite how very significant this decision is, nothing in America's democracy is ever over. It will come under scrutiny. But the question of Donald Trump is one in which there will be pushback from multiple corridors.
Lynne, let's talk for a minute about the makeup of the Supreme Court, because for much of the past 70 years, the ideological makeup of the 9 Supreme Court members, that was more or less evenly divided, with 1 or 2 justices acting as a swing vote. That seemed to be what was expected when it came to the makeup of the Supreme Court. After Donald Trump became president, he filled 3 seats on that court. The balance shifted to a 6-3 majority conservative. How has that changed the way the court works and also the way that it is perceived?
Well, the way that it has been perceived, it has been extremely negative, as everyone knows. The legitimacy of the court is very much at stake, not just because it is so lopsided in terms of appointments, but also because it will not take any action ethically to rule in the members of the court. And there are people who strongly believe that both Justice Alito and Justice Thomas should not have been sitting on this opinion in light of the partisan expressions that they've engaged in. So the lopsidedness of the court, which really began with the failure to consider Merrick Garland, has become a significant problem. And I have regarded the court with a great deal of reverence. You can imagine teaching constitutional law for one time. But I really want to echo what Leslie has said. People have a tendency to think that the Constitution and the court system are the answer to everything that goes wrong. And this decision really, really demonstrates the responsibility that the American public has for being the backstop, if you will. They really aren't the backstop, but they think of themselves that way at times, and they are going to have to step forward and vote if this is something to which they object.
Lynne, you also mentioned, you talked about in your last answer, specifically Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. There's been a lot of criticism the past several months of the financial and political ethics when it comes to those two justices, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. There are a lot of legal experts who have said that the court's ethics policy is in dire need of reform. Is there any chance that that is actually going to happen?
Not as I don't see one as the court is currently constituted. I think that it's going to require action by the other branches, imposing it on the court.
Steve, I saw you reacting as well just then. Did you want to jump in?
Oh, I think we may be years, if not generations away from the court sort of imposing those sort of restraints on itself. And yes, it will take public opinion, the congressional branch, and executive action, perhaps. But if all of those branches of government are under one party, then it's not something that's going to happen if it's the conservatives that are in power. And again, to have all three branches of power under Democrats or liberal philosophy doesn't seem likely to happen for a long time as well. But the point is, since the late 18th century, that we had these three distinct branches of government to balance each other and keep them from one of them from getting out of whack. And so now we appear to be going into a direction, and we have to say, I think, point out that there is a percentage of the population that will be behind this, that are advocating for Christian nationalism in the United States, who want a strong leader, who want to reduce the power of the federal bureaucrats. And now we seem to be heading, if Donald Trump is reelected, for a perfect storm, especially if the Republicans are able to capture both houses of Congress in this November's election.
Leslie, you know, the U.S. is very polarized politically. The Supreme Court is more polarized than ever before. How much trust does the U.S. public have in the Supreme Court right now, and how does that compare to the past?
I think right now people see the court as a partisan court. They don't see it as an independent court. Far too many people assume that because there is a conservative majority on the court, that there will be conservative a triumph of decision making. And that is not how people used to see the court. So I think there is an erosion of trust and an assumption of partisan polarized politics affecting this court. But I think, again, one of the big points that I think we need to remember is that the court cannot be forever out of step with the American electorate. The United States is in a phenomenal period right now, running up to these highly consequential elections. But if you look at the direction of travel amongst younger voters in the United States, amongst younger Americans, they are more progressive. They care about things like climate change. They care about democracy. They care about rights. They care about reproductive rights. They care about gay rights. So I think that ultimately there will be pressure on the court to maintain to be a reflection of America's society. That's always been the case. It is a source of contestation. And while, the short term is very, very concerning for many of us, I think in the medium term, the forces of democracy in the United States, this will be an inflection point, but it's not a unidirectional. There's not one direction of travel in the United States. And this is the period between now and 2028 will be one of remarkable change and contestation.
And Leslie, if I could just follow up with you on one point. I mean, the expansion of presidential powers, this is not something new. I mean, this is going back decades, right? I mean, you could talk about even Gerald Ford pardoning Richard Nixon in the wake of Watergate after Nixon resigned. And many people believe that decision cost Gerald Ford the election going forward. But we've seen protection over and over again of presidents and their actions in the past. This is just the most latest and biggest iteration of that, correct?
It is significant, but you made the case, right? And Gerald Ford paid the price. Presidents ultimately do pay the price. Elected officials do pay the price because ultimately people have a significant influence in every democracy, but especially in America's democracy, where it's not just people voting, it's also civil society organizations actively getting together to push back. Some of those push, they push in multiple directions. The National Rifle Association has pushed a gun rights agenda very effectively. But other civil society organizations have pushed in a different direction. It's a very complex but very highly robust system. Look at the work of the American Civil Liberties Union. So again, I think it's very critical not to just look at one direction of travel. The arc of history, even in the United States, even in this period, has tended to push in a direction that ultimately is liberal and more progressive.
Lynne, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I want to ask about the fact, how much is this judgment from the Supreme Court potentially going to delay the criminal case against Trump for allegedly trying to subvert the 2020 election? Because the trial judge in that case is now going to have to determine which actions by Trump were carried out in an official capacity, which actions were carried out in a personal capacity. How difficult is that going to be? And does that essentially ensure that that trial doesn't happen before the 2024 election?
I see no way that trial goes forward. The amount of fact-finding and briefing of what phraseology in the Supreme Court opinion means is going to take a great deal of time on the part of the judge in that case. So it's impossible to believe that it would go off before the election. I would be surprised if it, honestly, if it went off before the summer of 2025.
All right, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to our guests, Lynne Rambo, Steve Herman, and Leslie Vinjamuri. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.